While the world is full of stunning destinations, there are some places where the beauty is overshadowed by extreme danger. In this video, we're diving into the top 10 most dangerous countries to visit in 2024, places where war, terrorism, political instability, and violent crime are everyday realities. These countries are grappling with conflicts that put both locals and travelers at serious risk, with dangers ranging from terrorist attacks and civil wars to kidnappings and unpredictable violence. 10. Iraq. Iraq's modern history is shaped by decades of war, starting with the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, the Gulf War in the early 1990s, and the U.S. invasion in 2003. The ousting of Saddam Hussein led to a power vacuum, allowing insurgent groups like ISIS to rise and wreak havoc. While ISIS has been largely driven out of its territories, its remnants remain active, particularly in rural areas, conducting frequent terrorist attacks. In addition to this, sectarian violence between Sunni and Shia factions continues to destabilize the country. Iraq faces constant threats of bombings, kidnappings, and armed clashes, especially in regions like Baghdad and Mosul. Even areas deemed safe for locals can quickly become dangerous for foreigners. Military checkpoints and armed militia groups further complicate travel. Though rich in history and culture, Iraq is still reeling from war, and it will be some time before true stability returns. 9. Russia. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 set off a series of internal and external challenges. International sanctions crippled its economy, leading to shortages of goods, rising inflation, and unrest in certain regions. The government's increasingly authoritarian stance has made Russia dangerous not only due to conflict near its borders but also because of growing internal repression. Political dissent is met with swift, often brutal crackdowns, and foreign travelers, especially from the West, are at risk of being detained or accused of espionage. Aside from its volatile political situation, Russia has complex issues with terrorism, particularly in regions like Chechnya and Dagestan, where separatist movements and Islamist groups continue to operate. The Russian government has ramped up surveillance and military control, making travel risky, particularly for journalists, activists, and anyone perceived as a potential threat to state security. With rising tensions, foreigners are advised to exercise extreme caution and avoid areas near Ukraine or the Caucasus. 8. Sudan. Sudan has been in turmoil since 2023 when a violent power struggle between the Sudanese armed forces and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces erupted. What began as a political crisis has devolved into a full-scale conflict, with both factions vying for control of the capital, Khartoum, and other key areas. The situation has displaced millions and created a humanitarian disaster, with people facing shortages of food, water, and medicine. Traveling to Sudan is extremely hazardous, as civilians are often caught in the crossfire, and there are widespread reports of looting, abductions, and sexual violence by armed groups. In the western region of Darfur, ethnic violence continues to rage despite previous peace agreements. Armed militias frequently target both locals and foreigners, making the risk of kidnapping or violent crime particularly high for outsiders. The ongoing violence has made large parts of the country no-go zones, and even the major cities are not safe for tourists. 7. Somalia. Somalia has been locked in conflict for decades. After the collapse of the central government in 1991, the country became a breeding ground for warlords and militant groups. Al-Shabaab, an extremist Islamist faction linked to Al-Qaeda, has established control over vast areas of southern and central Somalia. They regularly carry out suicide bombings, assassinations, and large-scale attacks, particularly in Mogadishu. The group's influence and the absence of a strong central government make the country deeply unstable. In addition to terrorism, piracy remains an ongoing issue along the Somali coast, threatening international shipping and making the region dangerous for maritime travel. Traveling within the country is fraught with risks, kidnappings for ransom are common, and even major cities are not safe. Al-Shabaab frequently targets civilians and government officials, and road travel is extremely hazardous due to checkpoints controlled by armed factions. Visitors to Somalia are at high risk of being caught in violent attacks or being kidnapped by militant groups. 6. Ukraine. Ukraine's war with Russia has devastated the country since 2022. What started as a territorial dispute has escalated into a full-scale war, with Russian forces attacking from multiple fronts. While Ukraine has been resilient in defending its territory, cities like Mariupol, Kharkiv, and Kyiv have suffered extensive damage from missile strikes and artillery bombardments. Civilian infrastructure, including homes, schools, and hospitals, has been targeted, leaving entire communities in ruins. The presence of landmines and unexploded ordnance across much of the eastern and southern regions makes travel particularly dangerous. The front lines of the conflict are constantly shifting, so areas considered safe one day may be subject to bombardment the next. In addition to the physical dangers of war, the psychological toll on civilians is immense, and the country's infrastructure is severely strained. Even in regions not directly under fire, air raid sirens and the threat of missile attacks persist, creating an atmosphere of constant fear and uncertainty for anyone traveling in Ukraine. 5. DR Congo. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC, is one of the richest countries in the world in terms of natural resources, but it has been plagued by conflict for decades. The eastern regions, in particular, are hotbeds of violence due to the presence of numerous armed groups vying for control over valuable minerals like gold, diamonds, and coltan. These groups frequently engage in brutal tactics, including massacres, sexual violence, and forced labor. The DRC's government has little control over these territories, leading to widespread lawlessness. Rebels and militias often target villages and displaced people, resulting in mass killings and human rights abuses. Kidnappings for ransom are common, and humanitarian workers are frequently caught in the crossfire. Diseases like Ebola also pose significant health risks in some parts of the country. Travelers face not only the danger of physical violence but also the extreme challenges of navigating a country where basic infrastructure, such as roads and healthcare, is often non-existent outside major cities. 4. South Sudan. Since gaining independence in 2011, South Sudan has been in a near-constant state of civil war, with ethnic and political tensions tearing the country apart. Rival factions, primarily aligned along ethnic lines, have engaged in brutal fighting, leading to mass displacement and severe food shortages. Millions of people have been forced into refugee camps, and entire regions of the country are facing famine. Although a peace agreement was signed in 2018, it remains fragile, and sporadic violence continues to erupt. Traveling through South Sudan is incredibly dangerous due to the risk of armed attacks, banditry, and the complete lack of infrastructure. Many regions are controlled by warlords, and the central government has limited authority beyond the capital, Juba. Road travel is perilous, with frequent ambushes by armed groups, and even humanitarian convoys are often targeted. The country's widespread poverty, along with a lack of basic services such as healthcare, only increases the risks for travelers in the region. 3. Syria. Syria's ongoing civil war, which began in 2011, has left the country in ruins. The conflict began as a pro-democracy uprising but quickly escalated into a multi-sided war involving the Syrian government, rebel groups, Kurdish forces, and extremist organizations like ISIS. Cities like Aleppo, Homs, and Raqqa have been decimated by airstrikes, ground battles, and chemical attacks. While some areas are now under the control of the Assad government, other regions remain hotbeds of insurgency and terror. The country's infrastructure is in shambles, and large parts of Syria are littered with unexploded bombs and landmines. Militias and terrorist groups still control swathes of territory, and kidnappings of foreigners are common, with some being held for ransom or political leverage. Many regions remain inaccessible, and even in areas where the conflict has subsided, there are high levels of surveillance, making it difficult and dangerous for outsiders to navigate safely. The lack of security, combined with ongoing violence, makes Syria an extremely hazardous destination. 2. Yemen. Yemen's civil war, which erupted in 2014, has created one of the worst humanitarian crises in modern history. The conflict, primarily between Houthi rebels and the Saudi-backed government, has led to widespread destruction, with airstrikes, bombings, and ground battles becoming a daily reality for Yemeni civilians. The war has destroyed much of the country's infrastructure, leaving millions without access to food, water, or medical care. Famine threatens large parts of the population, and the healthcare system has collapsed, unable to cope with the needs of the people. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, and ISIS also have a significant presence in Yemen, further complicating the situation. These terrorist groups frequently carry out attacks, and the risk of kidnapping or being caught in the crossfire is extremely high for anyone traveling to the country. In addition to the dangers of violence, the blockade imposed by the Saudi coalition has severely limited humanitarian aid, exacerbating the suffering of millions. Yemen remains a war-torn nation with no immediate end in sight to its ongoing conflict and humanitarian catastrophe. 1. Afghanistan. Since the Taliban regained control of Afghanistan in August 2021, the country has faced deepening instability and insecurity. The withdrawal of international forces left a power vacuum, and although the Taliban now governs most of the country, their rule has not brought peace. Rival militant groups, particularly ISIS-K, continue to carry out deadly terrorist attacks, targeting civilians, government buildings, and foreign nationals. Frequent bombings in major cities like Kabul and Kandahar highlight the ongoing threat of violence, with suicide attacks, improvised explosive devices, IEDs, and gunfire being common. The Taliban's harsh interpretation of Islamic law has resulted in severe restrictions on freedoms, especially for women and girls, who have been largely barred from education and public life. Foreigners, particularly from Western countries, face heightened risks of kidnapping, arbitrary detention, or worse. The economy has collapsed under international sanctions, leading to widespread poverty and food shortages, further fueling unrest.